Welcome to Watch Cozy. Before we start this episode, please subscribe to our channel. We work really hard to find documents and put together this podcast for you.
Okay, so you've handed us a really compelling stack of sources here. Articles, notes, everything you've gathered. And we're going to go through it together. It's a chance to really explore this material just for you.
Exactly. Think of this as, our guided tour through what you've put together. We're going to try and pull out the most important insights, maybe some surprising facts, and sort of connect the dots that are waiting there in the pages you've shared.
And the story woven through these documents is, well, it's complex and pretty tragic, actually. It centers on a young woman named Melissa Turner and the death of her fiancé.
Yeah. Our mission, basically, is to walk through the details presented in this material, understand the sequence of events, look closely at the evidence you've got here, consider the different perspectives that emerge, and ultimately just try to make sense of it all. Absolutely. We'll highlight the key bits of knowledge the sources offer, the facts that, really stick with you. So let's open these up and start unpacking this story.
Let's get into it. So the material introduces us first to Melissa Turner. It describes her as a 26-year-old model, originally from North Carolina, around the time these events unfold. And her work, as detailed here, involved creating adult content.
Right, and this background, it's not just biographical filler, is it? The sources seem to suggest it provides context for aspects of her personality and maybe her public image that become quite relevant later on.
Exactly. They note her distinct style and interests, things like a love for Halloween, horror films, heavy makeup, fantasy costumes, and just a general interest in acting.
And to understand how she got to that point, the sources actually take us back a bit, way back to her life around 2011 to 2013. She would have been, 18 or 19 years old then?
Yeah, late teens. And this period is highlighted because the sources reveal she struggled quite significantly with her weight throughout her childhood and adolescence. And it apparently led to her being mocked by others.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredibly tough. But it also seems like it sparked a major turning point for her based on this material. She started a serious effort to lose weight.
She did, through a strict diet and an intense exercise regimen. The sources mention a really dramatic transformation. She went from 140 kilograms, which is quite heavy, down to 95 kilograms in just 2 years.
Wow, that's a remarkable change. And what this material points out is how this new appearance really seemed to boost her confidence significantly. Is this when she started exploring, dressing up and creating those fantasy looks?
That's exactly it. And she began taking photos and videos and sharing these online, social media adult platforms. It also led to her first serious relationship, described as being with someone named Sean around this time.
And she realized she could make money from this.
Yeah, apparently she quickly realized she could actually make money from this content she was creating.
So it became a business.
Pretty much. The sources detail how she started producing adult videos under a specific account name and found, pretty rapid success. Built up a large fan base very quickly. And this allowed her to leave her 2 part-time retail jobs.
And it grew from there, didn't it? She and Sean started an entertainment website and a studio.
That's right, yeah. Set up a studio together. And this wasn't just for her own stuff. They were apparently producing content for others in the industry, too.
So things seem to be on a really significant upward path based on this material until, mid-2016?
That's when things changed. Around mid-2016, her relationship with Sean ended, and the studio subsequently closed down.
But she kept her online presence going.
Oh, yeah. Her online activity continued. And less than a year later, the sources say, she met Matthew Trussler on Tinder. He was 23 years old at the time.
Okay. And this new relationship is described as really passionate, and it moved fast.
Incredibly passionate and fast-moving is how the sources put it. Within less than a year, they were engaged, and by December 2017, they'd moved in together in a large house down in Florida.
Okay, so that brings us up closer to the time frame of the main incident. October 18th, 2019. They've been living together about 2 years. The sources lay out the events of that pivotal morning.
Right. At 8:45 a.m., the Hillsborough Sheriff's Office received an emergency call from that house.
And when the officers got there, the scene they found was immediately alarming.
Very alarming. After finding Melissa in bloodied clothes, the first thing they noticed, according to these documents, was a distinct blood trail.
A blood trail starting in the living room.
And leading straight into the kitchen, yeah.
And the kitchen, as described in the sources you provided here, is pinpointed as the main scene of the murder. Sounds chaotic.
Absolutely chaotic and violent. The material tells us there was blood splattered everywhere, items were scattered all over the room, there was broken glass, several kitchen knives were found, and also a folding knife lying on the floor. It really paints a picture of a significant struggle.
And from the kitchen, the blood trail kept going.
It did. It led towards the back of the house to an open window.
Oh, an open window, okay.
And then it went out into the yard, ultimately leading the officers to where Matthew's body was discovered near the pool. The sources state he had sustained multiple stab wounds and cuts.
Right. So at this point, the investigation is just kicking off. Officers immediately start searching the house, looking for evidence. And Melissa's taken to the sheriff's office for questioning.
And the initial interrogation, as it's detailed in this material, gives us a pretty interesting glimpse into the detective's strategy right from the start. Apparently, they didn't immediately hit her with the hard questions. They focused on what seemed like, well, trivial details first.
That's a fascinating tactic. Why would they do that? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, the sources explained there were a few goals there. One was to build emotional pressure on her, subtly. Another was to identify any immediate contradictions in her story before she maybe had time to formulate a really consistent narrative. And also to construct a really precise timeline of the day before the incident.
Okay. So they were looking for any crack in the facade, right? Any hint of conflict she might try to gloss over. So what was Melissa's first account of the day before, as she told the detectives then?
Her initial story, according to these sources, was one of complete normalcy, total calm. She claimed she woke up really early, 4:30 a.m., worked until 8 a.m., walked the dog with Matthew, she worked out in the garage while he cleaned the house, they went shopping together, he made dinner, they ate together, and they ended the night having some drinks. She specifically stressed there were absolutely no arguments or conflicts the entire day.
A perfectly ordinary day, according to her first version. The material also included a really interesting detail about the interrogation room setup itself.
Yes, this is a psychological point the sources highlight. Unlike the typical setup where maybe a suspect is put in a corner, Melissa's chair was apparently positioned right in the center of the room.
Making her feel exposed and isolated, I guess.
Exactly. The sources frame this as a deliberate psychological strategy, designed by the detectives to make her feel vulnerable, maybe disoriented, just subtly applying pressure.
And speaking of psychological aspects, the material also touches briefly on Matthew's past, doesn't it? Some struggles he had?
Yeah, they mention a history of substance abuse that apparently peaked around 2015. However, the evidence presented in the sources indicates he had stopped using by 2017, which was around the time he and Melissa actually met.
And the sources connect this history and her knowing about it to a moment in the interrogation, something about her tone changing.
Yeah, they noted a shift in Melissa's tone when she mentioned her boundary, her sort of rule regarding Matthew using substances again.
And this is where the sources suggest we might see her potentially controlling nature come out. They draw a link here back to her earlier life experiences being mocked, rejected maybe because of her weight.
That's the connection the sources propose, suggesting this could have led to adult insecurity and maybe a strong need to control her environment and the people in her life.
And they go a bit further, pointing to her intense interest in acting and modeling, suggesting this might indicate a need for attention, validation.
Right. The sources suggest this might indicate a deep-seated need for attention and validation from others. And combining these points, the material offers the perspective that this background could suggest. Potentially adding narcissistic personality disorder to her psychological profile. Now, it's not a diagnosis, obviously, but it's a lens offered by the sources to help understand the potential dynamics at play.
It provides a potential framework, I suppose, for interpreting her behavior and maybe motivations throughout the events in the investigation. Let's circle back to that initial interrogation. The sources mention specific body language cues from Melissa during this time.
The material notes long periods where she apparently sat very, very still, which is interpreted as indicating emotional suppression. Her posture and stillness also showed discomfort, but critically, it looked like a conscious effort to appear calm, to hide her anxiety from the detectives.
So there's a disconnect there between the calm story she's telling and these subtle physical signs that the sources suggest indicate distress. What about her account of the morning of the incident itself? What did she say happened that morning?
Her claim was that she simply overslept and didn't wake up until around 8:30 a.m. that morning.
Okay. Now, by this point, the detectives are starting to see the initial forensic reports coming in from the scene. Based on that, the detective asks her directly if Matthew's death could have been an accident, right?
Correct. And this is where the sources make it very clear. The forensic evidence that was uncovered at the scene strongly contradicted any theory of an accident.
Let's walk through that forensic picture as it's presented in the material you gave us. What specifically argued against it being an accident?
Okay, first, the location of the body and that blood trail. The trail leads away from the kitchen area where the main struggle seems to have happened. That suggests Matthew was attempting to flee after being injured. You don't typically see someone creating a long blood trail away from the source of an accident injury while trying to escape.
Right, that makes sense. And the nature of his injuries, you mentioned multiple wounds.
Yes, and specifically, the deep cut on his right hand is described as a classic defensive wound. This is a really key detail. It indicates he was actively trying to protect himself, trying to disarm an attacker, which means he perceived an immediate life-threatening danger coming towards him.
And the kitchen being the main scene was also backed up by blood spatter evidence.
Yes, the blood spatter patterns within the kitchen area confirmed it was the primary site of the violent struggle. The material also notes that some blood patterns on the floor suggested he fell at least once during the fight.
And the angle of the spatter could tell them something, too.
Absolutely. The sources mention an upward angle of some blood spatter. That indicates that the perpetrator was likely standing and sort of in control, while the victim was probably bent over or already on the ground at that moment.
What about the broken glass found in the kitchen? Did that fit the picture?
Interestingly, the sources point out there was a lack of significant blood near the broken glass. This detail is presented as potentially suggesting the scene might have been altered or manipulated after the main events occurred, perhaps to mislead investigators about what actually happened or maybe the sequence of events.
So even early on, the physical evidence is painting a picture of a violent, definitely not accidental attack, and maybe even an attempt to clean up or stage the scene afterwards.
Precisely. And during a break in that initial interrogation, the initial medical examiner's report arrived at the station. And this added another critical piece of information that really solidified this picture.
And that critical detail was
The discovery of a deep wound on Matthew's back. This was in addition to the injuries on his hands and feet. And this back wound is crucial, according to the sources, because it specifically ruled out any possibility that Matthew's injuries were self-inflicted. It provided pretty undeniable confirmation that a violent struggle involving another person had taken place.
Okay, so while the detectives are processing this major new finding, Melissa is given a break.
Yes, she was given a break. They took photographs of wounds on her hands, collected DNA, fingerprints from her. The sources indicate the detectives were basically gearing up for a second round of questioning, knowing they now had powerful forensic evidence that flat out contradicted her initial story.
And it was during this short break that investigators back at the house made another huge discovery.
An incredibly significant discovery, yeah. They located a neighbor's surveillance camera. Now, the video angle wasn't perfect for seeing the whole backyard, but it had one vital capability: audio recording.
Audio, wow, that changes everything.
It really does. The sources highlight that this camera picked up audio coming from Melissa and Matthew's house between approximately 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. that morning.
Right in that crucial pre-dawn window. So when the second interrogation began and the detectives knew they likely had this audio, what happened?
Well, Melissa initially tried to stick to her original story, the perfectly normal day, waking up late. But the increased pressure from the detectives, combined with the implied weight of this new evidence they clearly had, forced her to start, well, altering her narrative.
Yeah.
Gradually.
What was her slightly revised account then?
She now did remember an argument, but she downplayed it significantly, described it as just a brief argument with Matthew because he woke her up around 4 a.m.
Okay, brief argument. And how did the recorded audio line up with that description?
Well, the sources emphasized that the recorded audio, especially when you line it up with the timeline of Matthew's death, completely contradicted the idea of just some short, minor disagreement. It suggested a much more intense and probably prolonged confrontation was occurring during that 4:00 to 4:30 a.m. window.
And did the audio capture Matthew being aggressive? Because that would be relevant to a self-defense claim later.
That's a key point the sources highlight. The audio, as it's described here, does not contain yelling or aggression coming from Matthew. This suggests he was likely in a more passive or perhaps defensive role during the confrontation, which, helps rule out claims of an accidental or even retaliatory injury on Melissa's part, and instead points towards an aggressive attack, maybe originating from her side.
So at this point, the detectives must have been pretty certain she was lying, or at least holding back a lot. And Melissa seems to realize she's kind of cornered.
Yes, the sources note this is the point where Melissa likely understood her initial narrative had completely collapsed. She needed to change her strategy, fundamentally.
And that's when the questioning stopped.
That's when she requested a lawyer, which of course immediately halted the interrogation. The sources then offer some insight into her psychological state when she was left alone in the room. She's described as exhibiting signs of intense anxiety, panic, guilt, maybe dissociation, just a severe stress.
It sounds like her mind was really struggling to process the reality of the situation and the implications of her stories falling apart.
The sources suggest her brain was essentially trying to deny the reality of what was happening,
Yeah.
almost like a defense mechanism, to cope with the overwhelming stress and her collapsing narrative.
So after this, she was initially charged with second-degree murder.
Correct. And the sources mention that because of her significant income from her online work, she was actually able to post bail pretty easily and was released from custody while she was awaiting trial.
And then she appeared in a television interview and presented yet another version of events, a third one.
Yes, exactly. A completely new story, this time crafted for a public audience and, likely part of her legal defense strategy.
What was this third narrative?
In this version, which was presented clearly as a self-defense claim, she stated that during the struggle, Matthew hit her head and it briefly knocked her unconscious. She claimed that just as he put the knife down to start strangling her again, she managed to grab the knife and stabbed him once in the back, purely to save her own life.
She specifically claims she only inflicted the back wound.
That's the highly strategic detail the sources point out. It's quite, clever, possibly guided by legal advice. You see, since the medical examiner's report had cited the wound on Matthew's hand as the ultimate cause of death by claiming she only caused the back wound, she was essentially trying to avoid admitting direct responsibility for the fatal injury under this new self-defense narrative.
Which, as the sources highlight, leaves a very large question hanging, doesn't it? If this self-defense story, where she was supposedly fighting for her life, was the actual truth, why didn't she tell the detectives that version right away during the interrogation, instead of giving them two completely different, much less dramatic accounts first?
Exactly. Her failure to offer this self-defense claim when she was first questioned is a major inconsistency the material really underscores.
Okay, so moving towards the trial itself, the sources detail two particularly significant pieces of evidence that were presented in court.
Right. The first was video footage. This came from a motion-activated camera located inside the house.
And this captured specific moments right around the time the neighbor's audio picked up activity.
Yes. The sources give specific timestamps, which are pretty chilling. At 3:39 a.m., Melissa is seen entering a room. Just 3 minutes later, 3:42 a.m., Matthew goes to the kitchen, and he's followed very closely by Melissa. And the sources note a disturbing detail captured right then. The prosecution pointed out she appeared to have a look of hate on her face as she followed him into the kitchen.
Wow, a look of hate. That's a chilling observation from the footage.
It is. Then, a bit later, at 4:09 a.m., Melissa is seen standing by the front door, apparently talking to herself. The prosecutor also drew attention to a faint red spot visible on her right hand in the video at this time, suggesting it could potentially be blood.
And there was also footage from later that morning.
Yes, the sources mention a clip time-stamped at 8:35 a.m. It shows Melissa walking around the house, appearing as if she had just woken up. Now, this contradicts her initial claim to detectives that she woke up at 8:30 a.m., and it suggests she may have actually been awake and active much earlier than she admitted, possibly during that 4-hour gap before she called 911.
How did the defense try to counter this video evidence?
Well, the defense argued the video quality was just too poor to definitively confirm the presence of blood on her hand. They stuck to the self-defense claim, blaming Matthew's behavior, saying he was aggressive possibly due to intoxication or maybe underlying mental health issues. They also tried to discredit the neighbor's audio, claiming it had been manipulated somehow to make Melissa's voice sound louder than it actually was during the confrontation.
Okay, what was the second key piece of evidence presented at trial?
This was data recovered from Matthew's smartwatch. It was apparently still on his wrist when his body was found.
Ah, the smartwatch. And what crucial information did that provide?
The data showed his heart rate stopped at 4.31 a.m.
4.31 a.m. That aligns incredibly closely with the time frame captured by the neighbor's audio recorder, right? That 4.00 to 4.3 a.m. window.
Precisely. The sources connect these two pieces of digital evidence very powerfully. The 4.31 a.m. time of death indicated by the smartwatch data fits squarely within the window of that audio recording. And the material suggests the audio potentially captured Melissa saying something like, "What did I do?" right around this critical moment when Matthew's heart stopped.
This brings us to another major point from the sources, The significance of that long delay in calling the police.
Yes, this is a point the sources emphasize really strongly. There's a clear, undeniable 4-hour gap between the estimated time of Matthew's death at 4:31 a.m. and Melissa's 911 call way later at 8:45 a.m.
4 hours, that seems significant. What does a delay of that length often suggest in cases like this, according to the material?
The sources suggest that such a prolonged delay is often indicative of intentional actions occurring during that time. Specifically, things like assessing the scene, maybe manipulating evidence, and certainly formulating a narrative or a plan before contacting authorities.
That makes stark sense when you put it like that.
A 4-hour delay, as the material points out, is highly inconsistent with genuine shock or a true self-defense scenario. In those cases, the instinct would typically be to immediately call for help for the injured person. Right. Regardless of the circumstances. Her failure to render any medical aid or call for help sooner also suggests, according to the sources, that her priority during that crucial time was perhaps her own safety and preparing a story, rather than trying to save the victim.
So with all this evidence presented, the forensic findings contradicting accident or self-harm, her shifting and inconsistent stories, the compelling audio, the in-home video footage, the smartwatch data pinning down the timeline, and that significant delay the trial finally concluded.
It did. On February 18, 2022, the sources state the jury deliberated for a considerable amount of time, actually. 8 hours spread over 5 different sessions.
And their decision.
The material states the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict for second-degree murder with a weapon.
And the sentence Melissa received for that?
She was sentenced to 20 years and 6 months in prison.
And sources mention she is currently incarcerated in Florida.
Yes, that's correct. And her projected release date, according to the information provided here in your documents, is April 27, 2042. At that point, she will be 49 years old.
It's quite a journey the sources take us on, isn't it? From her, challenging youth and that dramatic personal transformation to a life built on creating a specific public image, a relationship described as passionate but clearly volatile, and ultimately this tragic and violent end revealed through all this forensic and digital evidence.
It really does highlight the power of piecing together these different kinds of information, doesn't it? The psychological background, the physical evidence from the scene, the witness accounts, or in this case, the lack thereof, during that critical window. And increasingly, the inescapable data captured by everyday devices like security cameras and smartwatches.
This case, as laid out in this material you shared, it really makes you step back and consider how incredibly difficult it must be to determine the actual truth when someone presents multiple, vastly conflicting stories about the same event. It's a powerful reminder, I think, that the physical and digital world can sometimes hold a silent testimony that contradicts the narratives people create.
And it kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it, about that complex interplay between someone's past experiences, maybe deep-seated personality traits, and how those elements might just erupt or manifest in moments of sudden, extreme conflict and violence. It's a disturbing thought.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing this fascinating material with us and allowing us to explore this complex case with you.
We hope this exploration of the documents you provided gave you the insights and the understanding you were looking for.
Thanks for joining us as we looked into your sources.